push-pull production. I like to use this because I think this really epitomizes why push-pull is really good. So let's say that you own a seafood restaurant and you specialize in having fresh seafood every night, and you always pride yourself on having a catch of the day and a very robust menu. So if you were going to create a seafood restaurant, which strategy do you think would work best, push or pull?
Probably pull.
Okay. Pull would work, and in a way, I guess push would work. So when we look at pull versus push, okay, the pull is great because we can reduce costs because you have less stuff in your system because you only pull stuff out as required. But unfortunately, when you reduce costs by having less stuff in the system, your reduced work in process and your inventory restricts your ability to react to high variations. So if your forecast is for five items per month, and all of a sudden there's a sudden request for 6 or 7 or 8 or 10, that puts a huge demand on your suppliers to suddenly ramp up. And because we deal with such short lead times, they have to ramp up their output in a very short time. Okay, so, and some companies can do it. Some companies specialize in having all this excessive capacity so that they can do that with certain products. Obviously, like I tell people, you can't put 9 women in a room and get a baby in a month. You have some constraints, unfortunately.
That's a great example.
Thanks.
Does the length of the supply chain have anything to do with that work in progress and inventory? Because I'm thinking, like, let's say take a sushi restaurant in Tokyo. They got the Tokyo Fish Market right there, so they can just immediately go back and pull as needed.
Right. You're absolutely right. This is where the push-pull comes into play, and you'll see that in a minute. You're right. Push really needs very small lead times because of that, because you need to be able to react quickly to variations. Now, of course, you can use safety stocks or what they call buffer stocks, as you may have heard in Theory of Constraints, to minimize the impacts of sudden variations in demand. But overall, a lean system or a pull system really relies on having low lead times and fast demand. Well, I guess lead time, the demand signal is part of the lead time. If it takes you 3 days to tell your supplier that you need to build something, you have to add that into your lead time, obviously. So overall, you want really short lead times, because if you don't, you become very vulnerable when you have variation. Okay, and that's where a push system has an advantage. If you have a very high variation or you have a very undisciplined supply chain, you might want to go push because, yeah, you'll suffer from excess inventory or the risk of excess inventory, but at least that vulnerability of having low inventory in your supply chain is kind of mitigated. Does that make sense? So pull systems also use reduced cycle times with predictable outputs. So basically, if you're able to create a robust pull system, you reduce the time it takes to make something. So when the customer says, hey, I want blue instead of black, your ability to give them something that's blue is much quicker in a pull system than with a push system, where you say, oh, well, we have to stage a whole bunch of blue stuff. And if you don't have any more blue stuff, well, hey, like Henry Ford said, you can have any kind of car as long as it's black. Which is something about variation in a system. Ashby's first law of systems says only variation can absorb more variation. And this is where this comes into play. If you're going to want to absorb variation in your supply chain, you need to be able to have a system that can absorb the variation. So if a person says, I want blue, you have to design the flexibility in your system so that they can react to the new request. That makes sense? So now flexibility, obviously, as I just mentioned, pull systems allow products in the supply chain only when needed. So when the guy wants the blue one, it'll only pull the stuff that is required to make a blue product. But unfortunately, like I said earlier, you got to have very accurate forecasting or just-in-time demand reporting. So, so pull has strengths and weaknesses, obviously. So let's say that we did our seafood restaurant as a push restaurant. So we push products into our restaurant, but suddenly we would have a lot of inventory. And if we pride ourselves on having fresh food, obviously you can't hold a lot of inventory before you have things like spoilage. So obviously a push strategy may not be the best for something like a seafood restaurant because you won't have things will happen too quick. Things happen too quickly for you to be able to pull inventory because the thing about a push system is that we work to a forecast and we ship things out to meet a certain forecast set of sales. So lead time isn't as sensitive in a push system. So if your lead time, so if your customer orders a grilled fish sandwich and he's willing to wait 4 or 5 days, that's great. You can call up the fisherman and he can go out there and get that fish and everything else. But if he wants a sandwich right now, the push, obviously, it's not really good at getting things fresh, obviously. So push systems do not need just-in-time customer demand because they work on forecasting. But as we noticed last week with the bullwhip effect, you can have oscillations when you have variation in your demand forecasting, or if you have variations in your actual demand also. Okay, I don't know if you had a chance to play with that website where you put in the various variables. It's actually fun to do because you really see how like such small changes in demand cause huge oscillations where suddenly you go from like 25 extra to like now you're down 2 or so. That's a huge weakness of a push system. So, and as we know, push systems cannot react to immediate changes. So going back to your seafood restaurant, if you had a customer who suddenly changed his mind about an order, you're really limited by your inventory on hand as to how much you can react to a customer's immediate change in order. Okay. So let's go quickly back to a pull. If we design a seafood restaurant as a pull restaurant, basically you pull the fish out of the ocean just in time or with low lead time. So in this example, if a customer orders a fish sandwich, as soon as he orders a fish sandwich, you basically tell the fisherman, hey, pull that fish out of the ocean at this time. Okay. And then at the same time, that he'll have to pull out of the ocean the exact fish that you're looking for. Well, obviously, that's a weakness of pull. If your supply chain isn't able to give you just-in-time supplies, your pull system is going to fall apart. I think in like week 2 or 3, I talked about how Boeing really pushed suppliers to give just-in-time to them. And you had a lot of suppliers who didn't have a pull-compatible manufacturing system. They needed to have a lead time. And as a result, Boeing said, well, then you're going to have to take on the inventories on your payroll because we're not going to pay for it. We're only going to pull stuff when we need it. And a lot of suppliers got in trouble because they said, well, we don't want to absorb this extra cost. So all of a sudden, Boeing started to have shortages because you had your suppliers with a push mentality and Boeing with a pull mentality. And it's like, well, crap, this doesn't work. It doesn't work because the people needed extra time, extra lead time to get things out. Does that make sense? Okay.
Yeah.
Great. So now, use the pull systems for a seafood restaurant would require, like I mentioned earlier, fish to be pulled from the ocean and made available to the chef immediately. And he has to have any type of fish available that must be caught at the time of demand. And only the needed amount of fish So if you get an order for like, 4 sea bass and 3 tunas, that's all he's going to pull out of the ocean. Anything above that is waste, or anything below that, someone's not going to get their sandwich. So, and the customer demand must be made immediately known to the fisherman. So, which wouldn't be that hard. You can get the fisherman a cell phone, but his ability to pull the exact fish out of the ocean is kind of hard, obviously. But if we use a push system, you have the same problem. Well, it's the same types of problems. The fisherman would start to stock extra fish in anticipation of what you're going to do. But fish being the way they are, you may not want to have a lot of fish on your ship at one time. It's probably
Right.
not most sanitary.
In this example, he may pull them out of the ocean, but put them in a fish tank on his, in his whatever facility or on the boat, waiting to be sent to the restaurant.
Yeah.
But then with the second bullet, this potential for spoilage exists because
sure.
he's got,
and let's say that for
no,
you're right. Let's say for some reason you asked for 3 sea bass and he just can't get sea bass out of the ocean. He's like, I've been trying like crazy. His suppliers didn't give him the kind of stuff that he needs to provide you with your products. So obviously a push system has a little bit of flaw. And of course, you have the potential for shortages and high movement catch of the day products. We talked about a few weeks ago between cheetahs and elephants cheetahs, zebras, and elephants. If you have something that's an elephant, something that moves very, very slow, and all of a sudden it becomes the thing, the catch of the day, your elephant becomes a cheetah. Well, your suppliers have to be able to change their system to match your sudden cheetah, your high demand. So obviously you have the potential for shortages. So does that make sense? Awesome. So now, this is where the push-pull strategy comes in. The way that a push-pull strategy works is we're going to use a push strategy to a certain point. Okay. For instance, you talked about the Tsukiji fish market in Japan, where they have all the tuna and all the fish available.
right. They're the staging area.
Yes, that's a staging area. And what the restaurant owner will do is just say, okay, well, what kind of fresh fish is available at the market? And then he'll set his menu based upon what's at the market. Okay. So in the case of Dell, what Dell does is Dell says, okay, do you remember the theory of postponement, where you modularize and make common components as far up the as far up the supply chain as possible?
Yes.
Okay, that's a way to speed up your supply chain. Well, Dell does that. Dell uses a push strategy where they modularize or have common components as far up as they can until they have a point where the customer basically builds their own computer. But when you look at Dell, all the stuff that a customer customizes is all common products. It's so Dell modularizes or standardizes parts all the way up to the point where they're assembled. Then when the customer says, hey, I want this blue computer, Dell has everything available to make a blue computer. At that point, it's a pull system where Dell waits until the demand occurs. They have all these parts that have been pushed to the staging area. Then they build it. Then they send it off to the customer. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So a push-pull strategy within the confines of a seafood restaurant would work great, because you say, hey, fisherman, get me the fish that you're able to get. I'll create a menu based upon what you can give me. And a lot of seafood restaurants do this, especially like ones near water. They'll say, well, the catch of the day is something that some fisherman made available. So it's a pretty, and this is something that I believe came from Japan. I think Toyota came out with this first, but Dell has taken it and in some ways has improved it. So that's the concept of a push-pull strategy. Any questions? Okay.